So this is the first one in the 6, so from this 12. And once this is finished, then we're going to do an assessment and so on and develop our future program. But as you will see from the leaflet, we got at the bottom that we will be organizing a conference on 23rd of June. It's a very important day because 250 years ago, our country was conquered on the day. So we'll be having a conference to look at different aspects of how and what happened, and the impacts and the context and so on. So basically the format is this. The speaker will speak for about up to 30 minutes, and we'll have questions and comments and so on. Briefly and circle, we don't believe in political correctness, so don't feel shy, or don't feel that you're going to be picked, or you shouldn't say much. But we don't like people doing personal attacks or things like that. So we just ask that be very vigorous, be as critical as you can, or as searching in your questions and in your comment and discussion. But use logic, and evidence. This is what we ask. But no political question. And now to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mohammed. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for attending tonight's first seminar on Written Circle. I hope you find my talk relevant. I'm looking at an area that perhaps you might not know about, which is the mixed-race young people in Britain, which is as part of my research project, my second postdoctoral position that I'm working at the University of Kent on this. We're exploring the identity choices of mixed-race people. And we thought it particularly interesting looking at mixed-race people whose parents is drawn from 2 or more ethnic groups. We want to look at how much choice mixed-race young people have in describing their own ethnic identity. Do they feel that they can describe their own ethnic identity in the way that they want to be seen, for instance? Or if not, does it bother them whether they describe it and people incorrectly ascribe a different racial identity to them? What I thought might be interesting, I thought it would be interesting in terms of thinking about Bangladeshi and diasporic identity. There might be some kind of overlapping issues when discussing Bangladeshi identity. For instance, how do young Bangladeshis choose to describe themselves? So you might be able to learn from looking at the mixed-race experience and looking at how mixed-race young people grapple with 2 or more ethnic identities and how they choose those identities. And we're also going to approach that we've used to explore identity, whether it is also useful. We're quite hot on our research methods. We've developed quite strong research methods with a quantitative and qualitative part to our research strategy. We want to know whether that's relevant for looking at other diasporic identities. And lastly, whether we'll see a growing number of mixed-race young people who are of partly Bangladeshi origin. So we're a team of researchers. We received government funding. It's one of the big research councils, the Economic and Social Research Council. It's the largest grant that was given for mixed race research. We're a bona fide research project. The team of 3 of us. Peter Aspinall, Dr Miri, and myself. And the project lasts for 2 years, and we're a year into data collection. So I can't give you any analysed data yet, because we're still in the process of doing our field work. One of the main questions you might want to ask yourself is, why are we looking at mixed race? Why is it so important? Is it such a pertinent issue? But just to return to some of the statistics, to remind ourselves about how important mixed race is becoming. For the first time in the 2001 census, there were 4 mixed race categories. Before that, mixed race people didn't have a choice in which category they could define themselves as. They only had one ethnic category that they could tick, and that was probably inaccurate as it was. But in 2001, there were the 4 newly created mixed race categories, so white and black Caribbean, white and black African, white and Asian, and any other background. And from the 2001 census, what was recorded in England was there was 661,000 mixed race people. The data shows, as you can see, that proportionately, the largest mixed race cohort is white and black Caribbean, and then you can see followed by white and Asian, other mixed backgrounds, and white and black African. But what we discovered was that the mixed group accounted for 14.6%, so about 15% of the total population that belonged to groups other than white. So if you want to split the categories according to the census, of the BME proportion, mixed race was 15%. Okay, if that makes any sense. So mixed race is actually mixed race people are quite sizable in number if you compare it to the backdrop of the overall BME population. But just to return to why we're looking at mixed race, just to revisit some of the literature and why we've come up with this particular idea of looking at mixed race in the way that we have. What we were conscious of that there wasn't any systematic study looking at mixed race. And so, I mean, we were aware that mixedness can be experienced very differently. Previous work had been largely biographical, autobiographical, nothing with a strong research methods focus, so some of the work was largely anecdotal. You can't draw anything generalisable from that, or you can't, it would be inaccurate to use that particular data. Some of the literature on mixed race has given us sometimes conflicting ideas about how mixed race people choose to describe themselves. Some of the literature say people actually define themselves according to their father's background. Other literature says people define themselves according to their mother's background. Some of the literature tells us that, well, actually mixed race people, there's a real conflict and they are at odds with describing themselves. But what we wanted to refocus our attention to is how mixed race people actually come to terms with their mixed race identity, how they negotiate this identity, rather than having a kind of a crisis of conscience, so to speak. There's no conflict. We didn't want to focus on conflict. And we were also aware that some of the work on mixed race was primarily concerned with looking at mixed race people who had one white parent and one black parent. However, we've got to recognise that mixed race people in Britain have increasingly different and diverse backgrounds, and they don't constitute a homogeneous population. Then very little is actually known about the other kinds of mixed race people in Britain. So your mixed white and Asian, white and Arabs, for instance, or the dual or multi minorities that you get of the mixed race kinds of people that you find in the UK. We wanted to know whether mixed race people are able to choose, as I said, their desired identity, and if not, whether they agreed with the ethnic identities that they had been ascribed with. And so we wanted to dig into the American literature. As I said, the strengths of the American literature is vastly different from the work that you find in the UK. It's vast, it's voluminous. But what the American literature did, it helped us actually devise, develop and conduct our own study on mixed race. So the American research, we've used the American research to develop our own research methods. So we wanted to control for things like age, ethnic composition, education, social climate, and whereas the UK studies paid less attention to these sorts of issues. We also wanted to test whether the patterns of mixed race that were found in the US studies could be drawn in the UK. So there is this thing called the legacy of one drop of black blood rule. It's supposed to be black blood as opposed to black blood. So apologies there. This one drop of black blood rule is that if you have one drop of black blood, it means that in the US you're classified as black, even though you might be an 8th generation back removed from being black. But we wanted to know whether that case holds true in the UK, so we're not sure about that. And also, we wanted to find out in other ethnic mixtures, such as white and Asian people, or people with non-white minority mixtures, so black and Asian, for instance. And what we think and we suspect is such people are often thought as having an ambiguous racial identity, so the general public don't know how to describe them, don't know, visually, according to their racial type, people don't know what they look like. They seem to have an ambiguous racial identity, and therefore less likely to be given a racial identity by the rest of society. So we have some of our big questions, our big research questions. We have 5 large research questions, really. The first one, what choices do mixed race young adults in Britain feel they have? in terms of how they describe themselves in ethnic and racial terms, and how these identity choices differ for people of disparate mixed heritages. Second, what kinds of strategies do different kinds of mixed race people use in their efforts to assert their desired ethnic identity and or to resist an unwanted label, imposed labels, as well as in their efforts they may find that they wish to belong to a certain ethnic group, and how wider society responds to them. We also want to know what these choices mean in practice, these ethnic choices mean in practice, in terms of their friendship networks, their memberships in groups, and perhaps possible political affiliations. But we really want to know whether there is any kind of multiracial ethnic consciousness, mixed race consciousness emerging among mixed people. And then we've got some other big questions. How may mixed people's ethnic options vary according to their particular social setting? So we wanted to know whether somebody's social class background, their family culture and practices, peer relations, for instance, and their everyday interactions with wider society, how these sorts of social variables might influence mixed people's perceptions about exercising their ethnic identity. And lastly, we wanted to know to what extent do official data collection practices accurately represent the ways in which young adults choose to describe their mixed origins, and do such practices conform to their wishes, and how will officialdom, such as the census, need to respond to the changing dynamics around identity choices. Okay, so the focus of our research, I've kind of alluded to the fact that we're speaking to young people, but that's quite a large age group. So specifically, we wanted to speak to 18 to 25-year-olds. I mean, what the literature told us was that people in this age group may be at a cusp of consolidating their ethnic identities. As they leave home, they enter university, they enter the labour market. They are perhaps the bonds of the family and of their peers, they may weaken and become more distant. The literature suggests to us that this exposure to wider society may impact upon young people who may want to assert a different identity in their own right and develop a different, unique kind of identity. So we would like to get responses from about 300 mixed race adults. And we've decided to conduct our research at universities and colleges of higher education in London and the English regions. We've approached both universities and further education colleges because we wanted to get a cross-section of socio-economic groups. And more than anything, we wanted to bridge the literature, the gap in the literature, which has explored childhood and adolescent mixed people, but it doesn't look at this older group, and we thought that this particular age group needed a specific focus. So what we've actually, so I'm talking about this unique mixed methods approach, what exactly are we going out and doing? We've asked mixed race respondents to complete a questionnaire called the self-completion questionnaire. It's basically a survey that we've got about 52 questions that we want specific responses from them, we ask them how they define themselves, for instance. And then from a subset of that, so that's largely our quantitative data, a subset of that we then ask to interview. We ask them to leave their contact details and then we follow that up. And then we take a subset of that and we'd like to achieve about 60 to 80 in-depth interviews with our research participants. So kind of going in great depth about what exactly is on our self-completion survey. So, we based it upon some earlier work that we did with a charity and an organisation specifically aimed at mixed race people, a charity called People in Harmony. And we produced a report for them, a survey called Mixed Race People in Britain, the Survey of Terminology. And so we used that particular pilot to base our current research. So we haven't, as I said, analysed any data yet. But we asked things like how they describe their ethnic and racial identity. So we asked for a self-description and somebody might say white and Asian, half this, half that. We're quite curious. We asked them to write that in, so it's a free text box. We asked about whether the identity of their forefathers was important to them, for instance. or whether they would strongly identify with one racial group, or perhaps they can't. Perhaps they can't say. We also asked about schooling in neighbourhood, how they identified at school, for instance, what was the racial background of their friends, to understanding their peer group and whether that had an impact upon them in the way they described themselves. And we wanted to know a bit about their neighbourhood. So really trying to get a good idea of the setting in which, the social setting in which they grew up in. Then moving on to their new experiences of university and college, whether once they've entered university, they've entered college, whether the way they define themselves changes, whether they find themselves having to identify with a specific ethnic or racial group. And then we asked about the racial group, the racial background of their friends. We also ask about how others or the general public view them. And then we have some other issues about terminology and classifications. We have to include that because we have some input onto the 2011 census. It's called the Census Development Programme. So we have some input in developing the mixed race categories on there. And then we ask about other factors such as, we wonder whether parents' occupations, qualifications, religion has an impact on the way people describe themselves. And then the second part of our research is the qualitative part, as I've talked about before, which is doing the one-to-one interviews with them. So we asked them to, asked them to describe themselves, and we used the survey to really probe the participants, because we know that there's quite a bit of limitation with a quantitative survey. So really probe them and get to ask them how and why they describe themselves, specifically why. Then we ask about their parents and their family life. We want to know whether any particular parent has been influential in shaping their identity, or maybe a grandparent, for instance, and how their ethnic and racial identity compares to their siblings, if they've got any. We want to know if they have experienced any particular forms of racism, and if they have, how they dealt with it, what did they do. And then we also want to know about their responses to mixed relationships. So is racial identity important to them in their kind of future choice of partner? I mean, we're aware that there are kind of other avenues of research that we can explore away from what was strictly put into our bid. And so we're conscious that we may need to broaden our research focus and carry out work with a non-student sample, so we capture a further cross-section of socio-economic groups. So we have approached other organisations. I don't know if you've heard of Connections. Connections is an organisation especially aimed at young people, giving them advice on employment, careers advice, housing. So they're a disadvantaged group. And then we're also thinking about disseminating surveys to local authority employees, to widen our sample. And also we want to oversample some less known mixed race groups. For instance, white and Chinese they're a reference group for us. I mean, so far we've had some challenges in terms of survey dissemination. I mean, with all research, you get a really poor response rate, unfortunately. With the hard copies, we've probably received about a 10 to 15% response rate, but that's pretty average. We had that's with the surveys disseminated to students, but with our Connections users, we have an even poorer response rate, unfortunately. So it was less than 10%. We took a decision recently to launch an online survey with the student cohort, and we were advised that perhaps maybe students were more likely to respond because they are on computers all the time and they regularly use the web. So we've had quite a good response rate from our online survey so far. I've got a slide called Emerging Issues, and that's really to give you some data, but not from this particular research project, because as I said, we haven't finished even collecting the data, let alone analysing it. But I'm drawing from our earlier pilot survey, which we undertook for people in Harmony. What we generally found that there were issues of terminology, and also there were further implications for the 2011 census. So what we found is that the general choice among respondents to refer to themselves was mixed race. The only other term that received as much support was mixed heritage and mixed parentage. Respondents really disliked terms such as mixed origins, half-caste was completely out, and dual heritage and people found that offensive too. Dual heritage was disliked because the focus was limited to two groups. People might have 3 or 4 different heritages. And half-caste was disliked obviously because a majority of the respondents disliked it because it was kind of partial recognition of part of their identity, but also it has the kind of colonial historical connotations with being half-caste. But we also have, as I said, implications for the 2011 census. As I said, we've got input onto the development programme. We asked participants on our current survey to fill out several different versions of the census. We used one which is the American census, which is multi-ticking, and we used the current census. And we found that actually they preferred the way that the current census is collated. They found that the 2001 format the easiest way to collect data, but they still had problems with the categories. They raised issues on the lack of options for declaring a dual minority mixed race background, so somebody who might be black and Asian, or a multiple minority background, so somebody from Trinidad could have a black Caribbean and an Indian background, for instance, and a Chinese background. So according to our survey pilot, we also found that the white and Asian category received great criticism from respondents. This category seemed to conceal the heterogeneity of what the term white and Asian referred to, basically. I mean, white and Asian is commonly used to refer to mixed race people with a white and Indian, white and Pakistani, or white and Bangladeshi background. However, people, for instance, who are white and Chinese or white and Iranian sometimes do tick this box, but sometimes they feel quite ambiguous about ticking that box because they feel it doesn't really truly reflect who they are, because Asian in the UK largely reflects the subcontinent Asians. Okay, now I'm afraid the data's gone slightly skew left because of the way we kind of turn the slide. So I wanted to explain that. Just try thinking further about the white and Asian term, mixed term, and why that's misleading. I mean, precisely what does white and Asian refer to? We don't have the statistics for specifically white and Asian mixed race people. But what we can gather is the types of, we can draw from the census are the unions, in the relationships between white and Indians, white and Bangladeshis, and white and Pakistanis. And you can see that the white and Asian group largely refers to unions between white, British and Indian. So you can deduce from the data that perhaps white and Asian is primarily, the white and Asian mixed category is primarily white and Indian, far fewer white Pakistani and white Bangladeshis. But I thought we might just want to explore, again I'm afraid the data's gone slightly skew the rate of relationships within the Bangladeshi population and those who actually have relationships outside, who don't have relationships with other Bangladeshis. And you can see that Bangladeshis are the least likely to have an interethnic union. They're most likely to marry or to partner with somebody of the same ethnic origin. Again, so we can deduce that perhaps the mixed race population, the white and Asian mixed race population is not specifically, is not made up of many Bangladeshis. I don't know if that's any clear to you. I mean, what you can deduce from the data is that 93% of Bangladeshis have unions with other Bangladeshis. Pakistanis is pretty similar. And Indians, it's about 89% are most likely to have relationships with other Indians. So you get about, so on the other side, 6.7% of Bangladeshis don't partner or marry other Bangladeshis. 8.9% of Pakistanis don't partner or marry other Pakistanis. But the largest proportion, 10% of Indians don't partner with other Indians. I don't know if that makes any sense to you from the data. Okay. And I was just curious about whether there was any differences in terms of a gender mix. whether, for instance, we know that the pattern of partnering between whites and African Caribbeans is actually, between the different genders, is very different. So 50% of African Caribbean men partner with white women, and a third of African Caribbean women partner with white men. But you can't see the same, and which has a reflection upon the kinds of children and offspring that are brought that and develop from those relationships. But you can't see a similar pattern with either Indians and Pakistanis or Bangladeshis, who primarily intermarry with one another. So they are primarily, I think it's endogenous, and they intermarry with each other. I just wanted to draw some issues out from our in-depth interviews. As I said, we haven't completed that set of data collection. But I wonder whether issues of phenotypes or somebody's racial characteristics, whether that impacts upon mixed race people's self-descriptions. So on our survey we have one question, and we asked how the mixed race participant think the general public views their racial identity. And I interviewed one 18-year-old black Angolan and white Portuguese female, and she called herself white mixed race because she looked white, and so because her white appeared to predominate, so that seemed to shape her sense of racial identity. So perhaps external perceptions of her identity, because she looked white, has an impact upon the way that she defines herself. And I've interviewed other kind of mixed race participants, and especially white and Asian, white and Chinese, white and Arab, where they've always answered, or the public, more often than not, have said that the public view me as having an ambiguous racial identity. And I'm wondering whether, because they have an ambiguous racial identity, they have greater ethnic choices. So they can define, they're not given a racial identity. They have quite a lot of choice in the way they describe themselves, because society doesn't make an assumption about them. But I wonder with people with black and white mixtures, it does appear that they are limited in their ethnic choices, and it goes back to this one drop of black blood rule, that if you appear to have more kind of black blood, then you are kind of predefined as having a black racial identity, even if you have a white mother, for instance. But having kind of a black phenotype seems to predispose the wider public to giving them a particular black identity, if that makes sense. And just some concluding remarks now. As I said, I can't make any bold statements or anything, or conclusions, because we haven't analysed our data. We're still doing our data collection. So I'm really left with more questions about the issue of identity. I was wondering, do mixed race people have choices in the way they describe themselves? Or do they describe themselves in the way that others see them? Or is their racial identity a creation of a combination of the two? So do they describe themselves both according to their internal definition, but also according to what society views of them? And I also wonder whether it's helpful to explore identity and using this mixed methods approach. I wonder, and I'd like to know your thoughts about this, how transferable this particular approach is in exploring like monoracial identities, like Bangladeshi diasporic identity. Okay, so these are our contact details if any of you are interested in our work. And this ends the presentation, so thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Now, time for you to participate, ask questions, and seek clarification, or to share your own experience.
I just wanted to ask, is there a particular reason why you've left out the religious sort of background from your...
That's a whole... We do ask about religion and what impact it has had, but we think that's a separate research topic as it is. And I think that's an area that we could actually do a further research project on. It's a whole big topic in its own.
Because I think, that has a lot to do with identity, and I think it's quite an important aspect. It should be, that's what I think, really. Because then I think you have, these days racial, racism has so many contexts, but I think there's a greater focus on religion these days. So this racism aspect or racial difference, it's important, but I just think to leave religion out is, I don't think
You mean like mixed?
No, religious background, basically,
We do ask about religious
Bangladeshi
background.
Hindus or in Pakistan.
Well, with mixed race people, perhaps they more often than not they're brought up in two religious backgrounds. Okay, and so I mean, what we're finding, perhaps we could go out of London, we might find a different pattern. But more often than not, they do have choices, even in terms of choosing how they live their lives when they grow up. So we do ask about religion. We ask them, is religion important to them when they were growing up? What impact does it have on them currently? So we do ask those sorts of questions.
You please.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for doing the research. I've got some major problems.
Okay.
First, it's like origin. It seems to me like it's government surveillance science. They like to define and subdivide the non-Anglo Saxons so they can further divide us and be politically correct. But that's outside of power.
But non-Anglo Saxons, I mean, people who are mixed race more often than not are, in the UK 50%, they're not only minority ethnic. They are partly white.
What's the government intention? From your presentation, you're playing with a lot of the 5-year-old statistics from the census. I could have done that on the internet.
Okay.
And I don't know about the logical steps. Who Bangladeshi marries an Indian and Indian marries a Pakistani.
Mm-hmm.
How does that all work out?
That was to demonstrate that we can't draw from the 2001 census the numbers of inter-ethnic mixed race people who are from Bangladeshi, Indian and Pakistani backgrounds. The way the data is collected, Asian is subsumed under one category. And so I had to draw upon a different data source looking at inter-ethnic unions to see whether, trying to deduce from the offspring of these unions, because there isn't current data to collect of the different types of Asian groups, mixed Asian groups.
What department are you with? Is it demography or?
I'm not with any political department or government department.
No. Which department of the university?
With social science, sociology.
Okay. Another question is about the method. It seems really because you're saying that the hit rate, the response rate was very, very low. But the method, it wasn't very human. It was very biological. It's like here's illicit drugs. Anyone who wants them, come and reply to our email and get it. There's social science research, and but in geography, we just hit the road. Didn't you hit the road, hit the doorsteps? Search through social networks. It's something much more organic.
We have to try to be as unbiased as we possibly
It's
can.
not biased.
We have to be as unbiased as we possibly can be. And what we're finding is that with the American studies, some of them have used networks. But it's networks through universities, so they're a select group of people. They use snowballing, of course. We know the strategy for snowballing to hit the ground running, of course. But we have to produce a sample that is as unbiased as possible.
Can you not do that geographically? And is there much geographic spatial analysis?
You'd have to talk to my colleague Peter, who's our quantitative specialist. But in terms of geographical spread, do you mean
saying you've got a map of ethnicities, and there's this multi-culti debate going on. Where do you get more union when those unions happen, and what cities?
We use the census, and it goes down to ward level. Does that answer your question? The census goes down to ward level, so we look at that level.
Do you know which cities or where you get more mixed race people?
What we know is that the greatest number of mixed race people is in London. A third of it is in London.
Which area?
We've only got that statistic, a third of it is in London, and we suspect it's the inner London boroughs.
You got all now, we come back later.
I wanted to say, actually, identity itself, and those of us who are not mixed race, and finding our own identity is quite complicated. Because, for example, it's only recently when I was invited in Berlin by the ambassador there to talk about engaging Muslim communities, that I actually had to sit down and look at my identity.
Yeah.
1942, my father was an Indian. Then 71, he became a Bangladeshi. Or before 71, he was a Pakistani. And in a way, I carry all of those identities with me, as well as my religious one. And then being born and brought up here, I'm also an Englishman of some sort. So I wanted to congratulate your team for looking at this complex subject of mixed race.
Thank you.
In terms of your interviews, from 60 to 80 interviews, I think that gives you a 95% confidence limit in terms of stats, as long as it's spread wide. So I don't think there's going to be a huge amount of issues as to whether your results are going to be robust. But I was more interested in understanding how, you asked the question about discrimination, and I find it interesting when you talk about the black drop of blood.
Yeah.
And the whole debate on ethnicity and race has unfortunately been monopolized by our brothers and sisters from some sector of the BME community.
Okay.
And there's a huge amount of bias. One finds now in the community, for example, mixed race and the ambiguity with respect to models, the media is using more and more people where you can't tell their race and it's ambiguous, and that's in vogue. In terms of identifying oneself, I'd be really interested to know, because people identify themselves, and this is in research in terms of Muslims especially, and Hindus and Sikhs, that second, third generation, they actually identify themselves more strongly with whatever their race, religion, and so forth. But the sample of people that you are looking at from 18 to 25, do you have any idea in terms of which generation they fall in? First, second, or third, or similar?
Yeah, more often than not, they're second generation. Yeah, they are second generation.
So they're second.
Yes.
That might have an influence on the results that you come up with. And also, I think, again, I have no research evidence for this, but my humble experience of life, in terms of what sort of discrimination people face and labeling they face, that has a huge impact in terms of how they will define themselves. And not very long ago, 20 odd years ago, I can't remember the names of the films, but one used to see white guys with dreadlocks from mixed marriages, and they're trying to be black. And I've seen quite a lot of films where they're trying to assert an identity. I'd be grateful to know if you have any thoughts as to why people do that. Is it a lack of confidence, or what is it?
You mean
a mixed race person saying, I'm black rather than white, and I've seen that
that's interesting.
quite often. In a derogatory way, they used to be called chessboard pieces, or people who are mixed race and so forth. And I've always found mixed race people, they want to assert themselves, even if they look like that they're black. And there must be some reason for that.
I think it might be what you mentioned, is that there's one drop of black blood. And if, more often than not, somebody of a white and black mixture the general public will recognise racial phenotypes that aren't white. So normatively they don't, white and black mixture do not look white, so they're part of the other and grouped as black. And I think it's also a political statement, mixed young people, mixed white and black young people, wanting to define themselves as black. It's a political statement too.
Absolutely, because when you use the word other, one assumes that the host majority community is white. And that's for thus, and if somebody's rebelling against the system and making a political statement, then they have to be the other, and they define themselves.
And do you think the term Bangladeshi is actually accurate, given that 90% of the people, Bangladeshi people in this country are from Sylhet, and even within the Bangladeshi group, for example, Sylhet is one to intermarry people from other regions?
I think Sylhet is in Bangladesh, is it not?
Wait. One more question is something answer this question. Excuse me, please.
That's a big one. Away from this particular research area, but I can give my thoughts on that. I mean, you can have all sorts of debates about how we want to label ourselves or describe ourselves. I mean, the term Bangladeshi, as we know, has developed. It's a British concept that's developed. I mean, there is a problem again where we could call ourselves Bengalis. Again, it's another term that we can classify ourselves. I don't know, would you suggest that there needs to be some reform of that term for it to more accurately be reflected in the census, or for Sileti to turn up on the census? Is that what you're suggesting? I'm not sure.
I'm not sure, because I think Sileti is a different ethnic group, so usually each man in our groups don't look different.
But is that not as a result of, but does that, I wonder whether that happens with the diaspora within London. Does that happen also in Bangladesh?
Far less.
I don't know if I can answer your question, sorry.
Yeah, there's few of us who look at sort of research papers as well. I just wonder the purpose of this. I'm a bit skeptical on sort of capitalism. When you look at some of the ethnic militarism, I remember it used to be what a few columns as experienced earlier. Nowadays it's one page. And I think a few years time even previously pages. What is emerging here is each Bangladeshi community that I can see there are some types of marriages that are happening now. For example, Bangladeshis are marrying Afro-Caribbeans. There are isolated cases, so I think we now say isolated, maybe 5-10 years time, that could be a social norm. But my interest of coming here tonight was to know our first generation came, they married English women, European women. A lot of them did. A lot of them had a sort of wonderful life, they had children, grandchildren, and they lived as a couple to the end. Some of the men who married went back to Bangladesh and remarried. Some of them kept sort of, two marriages together, some just totally ignored the first marriage. So my interest here is, I just wanted to know what happened to those children. One of my white friends said they were lost children, lost children of 7, 8. I don't know whether your categorization would include some of those social aspects. This would give us.
It's a really good question, and I would really like to.
I don't know whether you can go well on.
I mean, our problem is we can't pick Bangladeshi and white and mixed race people from the census, because the census lists us, because it classifies people as white and Asian. So we can't seem to pick up white and Bangladeshis, white and Pakistanis, white and Indians. And how do we contact them if they're not classified according to those separate groups? Do you see what I mean? So how do we get in contact with, apart from through snowballing perhaps, and then that's a separate research project altogether. I think we'd have to have a side research project on that.
My final point, I don't want to see statistics, numbers. Instead, I want to see actual what people, their feelings, processes, whether they've gone, and some sort of empirical study.
I think the problem is if you don't have the quantitative data, then your evidence can be very anecdotal.
Yeah, what's wrong with that? I mean, I have a problem with something as sensitive as identity being quantified. Yeah, I come from a background in describing descriptions in scientific method, where in psychology in the 70s it was my professor amongst other people saying that you cannot take in social sciences the methodologies from physics, and we've gone miles into that other direction. Now when it comes to something as sensitive as identity, I like when you talk of some, because that is the case. But why do we have to put numbers to that? Why? What is wrong with anecdotal? Maybe your best research would be a lot of very good anecdotal stories put together in a way that anybody can read as a novel and can identify with. There is nothing to 93% of the population that is of any interest as far as identity is concerned, because you're taking something which is essentially unquantifiable and it's like mixing apples and pears. You don't get a fruit out of it. you get a mush, which when you ask what is it useful to explore identity, I would say yes, but not statistically. That is the problem of the research.
We do have the qualitative part of our research currently underway, but we haven't analysed that.
No, but you somewhere at the beginning you said you're very keen on your methodology. Now I think we should look into the kind of discussions that look into social science methodology in contexts which are non-statistical. Because the assumption that it has to be statistical is very, very inadequate for the concept of identity, that's all I can say.
We haven't finished collecting that part of our data.
No, identity is not data, it's individuals.
Well, that's part of our research. We are actually going out and interviewing people. We are undertaking field work.
Yeah, but it's very circular in the sense
it's an ethnography that you'd be looking for. Really, an ethnography where you plant yourself in a family and really get to know. That's a different kind of research, and it's completely bona fide. I absolutely agree, but it's a different kind of research approach. Yeah, you can.
No, you ask whether your research is useful. Now, one of the questions is, if you ask people what their backgrounds are, in the senses, you only have so many things that they can tick.
I agree.
Therefore, you are forcing the language in which people describe themselves, instead of generating language in which we can all describe ourselves in all sorts of different ways, which would be much more useful.
Well, we do.
Okay.
Honestly, we do.
See, going on the topic of language, now I think language is a very key part of identity and ethnicity. So if you have one of your participants, do you then ask them, obviously I'm assuming they've got mixed parentage, do you then go and probe further and ask them what language, if any, they would prefer to relate to? And furthermore, would they then like to go back to, and do they consider that their homeland? Let's say that they're from Black Afro-Caribbean and I don't know, some other. Would they then like to go further and go back there, or do they just consider themselves solely second generation British? Have you sort of explored that?
We do explore the issue of language, and we ask them whether sorts of languages spoken at home, where they learnt the language, how important that was to them in terms of accessing their culture, if you want to put it that way. And because we have a semi-structured interview, so we can deviate and ask about whether understanding a different language, whether that's important to them, visiting the other part of their heritage. So we do explore those sorts of issues, yes, but because primarily the majority of them are brought up in the UK. So what we are finding is that
their parents probably wouldn't have been on the
but one of their parents perhaps was born in the UK and the other perhaps was born abroad, for instance. And so if you're thinking about the issue of language and how language is carried between, perhaps what we're finding is that with some cases language hasn't been spoken and so the child hasn't learned the second language. In other cases, perhaps if a grandparent lived within the household, then yes, a language is kind of transferred and carried. So it differs. It does differ. And with white and African Caribbean partnerships, more often than not the language spoken at home is going to be English, because English is the language spoken between the two parents.
How many generations do you think it will take for the multiple interests of the Bangladeshi community for them to mix into the other ethnic origin groups? So let's say let's choose a figure of 50% of Bangladeshis. How many generations do you think it will take for them to blend in something like that? Because the reason why I'm mentioning that is because about 10 years ago I heard a news story that Margaret Thatcher was going to have an operation because she's a particular kind of from defect or something, and that comes from her Viking heritage. And obviously, lots of groups of people who arrive in this country, they blend in after a while, and their identities disappear. I don't think any Britons today claim to be Viking through and through, and when you get into reforms. But one can look at is when we lose our identity as Bangladeshis. How many generations does it take?
I think that depends on the question of the place.
Yeah, question big question.
I think that's assuming that Bangladeshis born and brought up marry only people who are kind of born and brought up in the UK. But we know it's a global climate now, isn't it? And people might that perhaps won't be the case, that there will be a dilution of identity. There's a constant stream of travel to and from London and Bangladesh, so perhaps that won't happen. Maybe there'll be a different kind of hybrid identity developing, kind of a global Bangladeshi identity between London and Bangladesh with kind of stream of partners, etc. I'm hoping that won't happen. And I can't actually answer your question. I'm kind of refocusing it and saying I don't think I agree actually. Because I think there is intermarriage, especially if the rates of intermarriage between other Bangladeshis are quite high. It probably will be quite a few generations down the line, because Bangladeshis intermarry and other Bangladeshis, either from here or from Bangladesh.
See, I just want to share something with you. I went to Indonesia and I met a lot of people with marriages between Christians and Muslims. And in some families, they don't change, they stay Christian or Muslim. And they agree among themselves, husband and wife, to bring in one child as Muslim, another child as Christian. I don't know how it actually works out. So I've met some people that say, oh, I'm Muslim, but my brother is, or my sister is Christian. I don't know how that works out. But you need you. And the blue top.
I think you might have a much better reception amongst people if it's phone rather than jumping out with the steps. I know you can do the quotes and stuff. If you jump out with history and textual interpretation, but more interestingly, how much work has been done in Europe on because identity is there, being like viciously, brutally destroyed in the castle overnight. I take Spain, which is Spain, Portugal. We're just remarking that in Portuguese, they definitely look Arab. Something's gone. Okay, you know what? Something Inquisition stuff has happened. As much research on there, or is it in a different language, or is it not in the?
The literature on mixed race in Europe is actually really limited. In Europe.
Do you see any government-sponsored surveillance sites ever uncovered in secrets?
I think you have to do a research project on that.
Yes, I see.
Over again.
Yeah, I mean, taking up the comments the colleague over there made, I love social scientists, they want to do thematic reviews, and then the physicists and the astronomers, they want empirical basis and think out of this world. Being a lawyer, I can find myself in between. But what I would say is, instead of doing thematic reviews, whatever research you do, it needs to be evidence-based, so one can draw some conclusions.